We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell.
My guest today is Carl Richards. Carl is a certified financial planner, author of The Behavior Gap, and his sketches and essays appear frequently in the New York Times. So welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Bob, thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation.
It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm eager to talk with you about what you've described previously as your new life's mission over the next decade, which is to help financial advisors become guides for a changing landscape and not defenders of an outdated map. And I know in a video that you've produced on this topic that you've identified almost 5 steps to that happening.
Yeah, I think first it might be helpful just to describe the what I see as the problem, and I mean I reserve the right to be wrong about everything I'm going to say in this conversation. But my sense after watching this, and I'm sure you have seen the same thing, like there was this element of, well, I mean, there's a couple of reasons for it. One, certainty is really tempting to sell, right? Because everybody wants to buy it. So certainty is easy to sell, but it's impossible to deliver, right? So we got that sort of conflict. And I think that's part of why the industry, speaking broadly, has part of the reason we have a bad rap, speaking very broadly, is because we've been promising to deliver certainty and we can't deliver it. And so we've been under delivering. So we got that problem. Then we got sort of the physics MD problem, right? Like just as humans, we want to reduce this stuff. We want a law of gravity. We want like that piece. And then the last piece, I think, is as the tools that we've used have gotten more sophisticated. I mean, come on, we're using like just the base Monte Carlo engine was designed for the atomic bomb, right? You know, because we've gotten more sophisticated tools, there's been this false sense of precision that's sort of crept in. And you hear people occasionally using Monte Carlo analysis saying, you know, using 2 decimal places, like 97.23% confident. Well, and then when you look at what's underneath all of that, you realize like it's just a giant pile of guesses, you know, returns, standard deviation, and correlations just to get my Monte Carlo number. And then if I'm doing any planning work on top of that, I've got a client's life, I've got their goals, I've got savings, I've got their kids, I've got a guess on a date of death, I've got inflation, tax rates, and then I'm going to draw a 30-year line with all that. So I think that's to me where I think we got in a little trouble, is just this natural desire to want to give people certainty in the form of a 30-year line called an investment portfolio or a financial plan or whatever we're working on. Yeah. And then that led us to be defensive about it.
So before you get to where it led you, a question about certainty, twofold. One is advisors want to deliver certainty. Clients want certainty, right? Sure. Otherwise, they could perhaps feel they could do it themselves, right? But the other is advisors exist in a world where certainty exists in other places. My washing machine works 100% of the time for the most part, right? My GPS works 100% of the time. So we've created expectations, perhaps that doctors, right, lawyers, et cetera, right, CPAs, we want some degree of certainty from the people that plumbers, right? I mean, we want things to work.
Yep. Yeah. It's really easy to understand how we get to that spot. But the problem is it's not reality. Like we can't deliver it. So getting to the spot where we are more comfortable saying, hey, look, I'm not sure. And you've seen this in the work that you've done. Like the more sophisticated, the more educated, I mean, go have a conversation with Eugene Fama and you'll get somebody who says, you know, I mean, it looks pretty much like this. I'm sure about this, but the rest of this stuff, like, Richard Feynman, right? Like those types of people are notorious for saying, I'm pretty confident about this thing, but everything else. And so I think getting to this spot where we're like, look, I'm going to do the best work I possibly can. And by no way am I sort of denigrating or underappreciating the work that goes into the spreadsheet. So we still need to be technical rock stars. Like I want to be able to look somebody in the eyes and say, Bob, you could look for investment. You could look for an investment solution for the next 20 years of your life, and you will never uncover something that is better than what we put here, right? Like, it's infinitely defensible. I can defend it till I can go toe to toe with anyone. And I'm not exactly sure how the future is going to work.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's actually the opposite of not being bad. It's like, that's why it's so valuable to have a real financial advisor, because they can look you in the eyes and say, like, think of this as like a guide. Like, if you go climb a mountain, and I've guided in really extreme circumstances, and I've also been a client of guides on rivers in New Zealand and mountains all over the world. And I know that if I'm the guide and a storm blows in, and all we have to do is go back, just go back and look at the plans you created in January of 2020 and tell me how they looked by March. And we've got a real clear 3-month line that didn't work out. The plan blew up. We know that if a storm blows in, instead of being defensive, sure, the client might be upset. And it's silly that they would be upset at me for a storm blowing in, but that's what I'm here for. I'm going to release valve. But it'd be even sillier for me to get defensive. Like, look, I looked at the weather forecast and I knew. Instead, I want to be able to look across the table and say, hey, I know it's a storm. And I get a little nervous when I read the news too.
Yeah.
And then I can grab them by the collar and say, I've got you. Like, we're going to go this way. I'm an expert, not at drawing 30-year lines. I'm an expert at making really important decisions with incomplete information. That to me is where we're starting to point, like, look, yes, I'm going to draw the best 30-year line anybody could draw. And I know the moment you walk out the door, it's wrong. And I'm going to be there to figure out how it's wrong. So it becomes not about being precisely correct today. I'm going to do my best to be precisely correct. But in the end, I know it's wrong. It's about being less wrong tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think when we can start to communicate that way, clients are like, well, yeah, of course. Yeah. Of course. So anyway, that's where it all comes from.
Well, you'll forgive me. I know I want to get to purpose and goals and whatnot.
Do whatever you want.
But one of the things that strikes me is that to do that requires some degree of experience. To be a guide requires experience. And I'm reminded of a time in 2008 when the market was collapsing and I was sitting at a financial planning conference across from a relatively young and new financial planner who was ashen-faced and distraught as the market was crashing, Lehman Brothers, et cetera, right? Everything was going away. And he looked at me and he said, I'm beginning to doubt everything I ever told my clients. And it struck me that he didn't have years of experience in order to sort of guide them through what was happening at that time, right? If he had been through 87 and 2000 and 2008, maybe you'd have some perspective and context to help.
No, I completely agree. I remember that time. I remember because I'd been through, whatever we went through in the late 90s, and then we, Y2K, which sounds humorous now, and 9/11, which certainly doesn't sound humorous, but we'd been through all of that, 2003 emerging markets, like all that stuff. And then in 08, 09, I remember in March of 09, I remember closing I can remember the feel of the door handle on the conference room door, and Barbara and Dan in that room, looking them in the eyes and saying, the only advice I had, which was stay the course. It would make no sense to jump out of it. We're in a lifeboat. It makes no sense to jump in the water. Let's stay the course. I know it's, all the things I would have said in that moment, but I remember the feeling of the door closing it as I walked out of the conference room. I remember thinking for the first time in my career, like, geez, I hope I'm right. And that's the core of this job, though, is you have to make mission critical decisions in the face of irreducible uncertainty, and to pretend, and I think this is where we get into this sort of defenders of outdated maps territory, is to pretend that you can get rid of the uncertainty. That's foolhardy. So what do you do when you're young? You've got to broaden your definition of experience. You've got to read the history. You've got to talk to the folks that have been around. You've got to come up with you've got to be reality based. You've got to know the plan will blow up. And when that moment happens, you've got to have a plan for how you handle it. You've also got to embrace one last piece on this. It's interesting. I remember in 2008 and 9, and after sort of recovering from that, just emotionally, digging in a little bit to, and I can't remember what the concept is called, but it's essentially the healthy, appropriate use of overconfidence. And it came from military doctrine, where there are times when you've got to be overconfident. You don't want the emergency, the EMT or the paramedic who shows up when it looks like you're going to die. You don't want them saying, looks like you're going to die. What you want them saying is, I've got you. We're going to make it. Stay with me. Right. And they even know that they're probably not telling the truth. Like, they're overconfident. And there's moments when, in the face of irreducible uncertainty, we've thought through everything else. We've got to say, this is the best answer I've got. Stay with me. We're going to be okay. Even if we have some doubts bubbling up in ourselves, it's the best answer we have. So I think that's a fascinating world. I love, how do we navigate uncertainty? How do we navigate complexity? How do we be more real about this? And I think we're starting to see more of it bubble up in the industry.
Yeah, certainly weathermen, when they're talking about hurricanes and landfalls, that we have a big cone right before it reaches landfall, and weathermen are perfectly happy not being absolutely certain about where landfall will come. Right?
Yeah, so. Yeah. I just think, and what's interesting, Bob, about this discussion is you start to realize that I think largely, like, once you've nailed the technical piece of this job, and believe me, that our ability to go toe to, especially the audience you're talking, the listeners of this, like you, especially in institutional environments, right? Like, we want to be able to look people in the eyes and be like, look, I'm telling you, I know what I'm doing here. Once we've nailed that, you start to understand the need to be resilient, right? The need for emotional intelligence, the need to take care of yourself physically, like, so that you can navigate in that water. And you can be, I've got a friend who works, he's distressed private equity sort of guy. And I mean, they get called in when things are, like yesterday, he was telling me, I just got a phone call from a company that said, we're going 100 miles an hour straight into a brick wall. We need your help. And he's like, I got to show up and make rapid decisions with incomplete information. And there might be jobs on the line. A business might go away if I'm wrong, and I still have to do it. And we don't have time for the fancy feelings. And I think there's an element of that that's true in our profession too. And then you start to realize, like, that's a whole new skill set that we need to develop to be calm, to be confident at the right time. Like, all of that stuff's really, really interesting to me.
Yeah. So speaking of new skill sets, as you think about your goal for the next decade and this notion of helping clients align their capital with what's important to them, is this notion of advisors helping clients define their purpose, which, I have a CFP. We're trained to identify goals long before we're not even taught to ask about purpose per se, right? It's a new skill that advisors have to acquire, new knowledge they have to acquire.
And I think, again, like, on the personal financial planning front, and certainly I've been in institutional meetings where, in fact, I remember it was a large university endowment. And the first question I had was, could somebody please help me understand why? I mean, we got brought in because things had gone sideways. Why is the money invested the way it is? Like, that's one of my favorite questions. Why is the money invested the way it is? And the only right answer, which is never the one that you'll get, but the only right answer is, well, because this portfolio gives me the greatest chance to meet these goals, right? In other words, the purpose. And in an institutional setting, that might be, I remember in the endowment, it was like, well, we want to meet the spending policy. Well, so there should be a link between the spending policy and the way the money's invested. It sounds ridiculous to you and I, but that doesn't dawn on most people. And I see this more in the high net worth space than I see it anywhere else, because for some reason, somebody forgets when they have a client come in with $25 million, they think for some reason they're going to care about the investment staff in London and the portfolio pitch, and before they even have a conversation about why are we doing this in the first place. So we've gotten really good at debating whether to take a plane, a train, or an automobile on a trip before we ever decided where we're going.
Yeah.
And all I'm saying, just go read. Like, this isn't woo-woo. Like, we can go all the way out on the spectrum to life planning, and that's amazing work. But way back here, go read Simon Sinek's Start With Why. Like, how am I supposed to help that university endowment if I don't know that the goal is to meet the spending plan? How am I supposed to help the individual client if I don't understand that this hard charging female CEO, really the goal, her big goal is she wants to feel like she has enough space to even think about having a family? That's an actual conversation I had with a client. Like, I just want to have a space. How am I supposed to build a portfolio if I don't know that? Right? That's to me why this purpose piece is important.
Right. And I suppose for advisors who have never sort of asked their clients about purpose, the first time they do it, they maybe feel like they're on unsettled, shaky ground. They'll probably get used to it at some point. But any advice for the folks who I know besides reading, anything? Wisdom?
Look, I think so. Let's just back up. So I think this is a conversation that can happen early on in a first meeting. And I think it's before goals, right? Like, and I really feel like if I was king, I would banish, you can't ask a client what their goals are until you help them uncover them a bit, because people don't know. There's a whole bunch of work. Renee Girard's work around mimetic desire. I mean, there's a whole bunch of work. Shlomo at UCLA, a whole bunch of work around like asking somebody their goals is like the last thing we should be doing. So before we get there, and we can talk about that in a minute if we want to, before we get there, we're just having a conversation about like, why are we doing this? So just find a question you like. Now, the initial question, there's people out there that are question zealots. They believe there's like only one question. I'm not a question zealot. Find a question you like. The initial question doesn't matter so much as what I call the go deeper transitions, right? Like where you just say, oh, that's interesting, Bob. Tell me more about that. Oh, that could mean different things to different people. Tell me more, right? Like go deeper. So a question could be something like, I'll point you to one. Of course, Bill Bacharach's work's easy to look up. One that I really like from outside of our industry is Dan Sullivan at The Strategic Coach has a question he creatively titled the Dan Sullivan question. And it's just, Bob, if we were sitting here 3 years from today, and he loves to use the date, which I'm not sure what the date is, but August 15th, 2023, we were sitting here 3 years from today, what would need to happen financially, personally and financially, in order for you to feel like the last 3 years have been a success? That's a great starting question. It's got some framework. It doesn't feel, too woo-woo or California, if you will. And then you can say, oh, tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. And the skill you're looking to develop is curiosity, right? And we're looking to get little answers like the CEO of the female CEO who said, Carl, I just want some time. Oh, tell me more about that. I want some flexibility. Tell me, why is that important? Geez, I actually want to have a family. I just haven't had time to think about it. Then I can say, oh, Julie, let's put some framework around what would need to happen in order for you to pull that off. And when we do that, would it be okay if we call it a goal, right? Like that's what I mean by leading them into goals. So there's some sort of tactical help I hope that's helpful.
No, I think it's extremely helpful because we're all trained to say, what's your goal? You want to retire at age 55 or 65 with $1 million in your portfolio, and you want to be able to fully pay for your children's college education and buy a retirement home in Steamboat Springs or whatever, right? I mean, those are sort of the easy ones, so to speak, right? But they're not necessarily about purpose.
Well, to me, and let's just riff on that for a minute. Like I would say, if you said that to me, Bob, I would say, wow, it sounds like you've done a lot of work on that. Tell me a little bit more about the age 65, right? Like why what's behind that? And I can guarantee you 100% of the clients who come in with those kind of goals, those are 100% mimetic, right? They've just heard that from someone else. And if you say, well, what is it about 65? Well, I don't know. It seems like what everybody else does.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's pretend for a minute that you don't have to do what everybody else does. Like, what would you do?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, you said $3 million. Like, so just all you don't, it's not confrontational. It doesn't need to be uncomfortable. You don't have to ask people to write their own obituary if you don't want to. You can just say, tell me a little bit more. That's interesting. I would just be interested. Like, that's all they have to do.
Yeah. Carl, in your video, you talk about helping clients formulate goals when they don't have any. And so I'm eager to talk more about that, but also this notion of, Michael Kitces has written about it, I'm sure you have too, this notion of goals-based planning and how people don't know their goals, and even the goals that they say they have aren't necessarily the ones that they want, right?
Yeah, totally. I don't know who first said it, but I love that quote that goals-based planning is a little bit like saying oxygen-based breathing. I don't know who said that. It certainly wasn't me, but I love that. But of course, but yeah, that's why I think we should replace the word goal with guess.
Yeah.
Right? Like, just, it's going to change. And so if we can go back to that original story, I like another one, I can remember this conversation with a client who, his name was Jerry, and he was from like Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation. And, he wasn't going to cry in my office, like his duty, community, family. And I said, Jerry, tell me, I used to love Bill Bacharach's question, a version of it. I would say, why is money important to you? And Jerry said to me, this is the first meeting at a big brokerage firm, which will go unnamed, but has a bull as its symbol, is owned by a bank, right? Like, this was like the investment place. And so, Jerry, why is money important to you? And he said, it's sort of awkward pause, like, he's like, well, geez, I just don't want to be a burden to the kids. Mm. Now, he'd never said that to anybody else. Now, he wasn't going to cry. It wasn't going to be, but burden to the kids. Oh, tell me a little bit more about that. Like, and so then we could say, Jerry, what would need to happen financially in order for you to not be a burden to the kids? Let's put some framework around that. Mm. Oh, I need this, this, and this. Oh, amazing, Jerry. Would it be okay if we call that a goal? Right. So now instead of saying in our intake form in the foyer, which just, please, I did that. I know, empathetic hug, I get you, but please, let's stop doing that. Right. Instead of saying, what are your goals? We've taught Jerry what the goal is. And Jerry said something like, I want a check in the mailbox for $5,000 a month or whatever. Like, okay, that would mean I wouldn't be a burden to the kids. All right, cool. Now, what do we know about that goal? We know it's a guess. So it's okay for us to say, awesome, we'll build a plan based around that. Then next time we meet, we can say, Jerry, how's the $5,000 feeling? Oh, it's a little bit, you know what, actually, it's been 3 months and I'm noticing there's a bunch sitting in the savings account. Oh, well, should we lower it? Or, Carl, actually, what do you think? Could we handle 7,500? So the process of being less wrong is the same with the goal. You're just trying to narrow in on it over time. And it should come as no surprise. People don't know. I don't know.
Right.
I didn't know what I literally, we're working on a huge project right now that I didn't know about 6 months ago, let alone 10 years ago. So if we can always treat this stuff as this, and the cool thing, Bob, about this is it puts you in such a great place as far as the job, right? Like your job becomes this never-ending process of aligning use of capital with goals, figuring out the goals are, oh, that's a little adjustment, let's change. So it's never done. It's this beautiful relationship. It's not an event or a product.
Yeah. In your video, you talked about Monte Carlo with respect to goals and how we create this false sense of precision. And I was reminded of a paper that Derek Tharp had written, where he, in essence, said, you could use a 50% probability of success. And as long as you monitor it every year, it will be fine. And I thought, well, at that point, it's nothing more than a coin toss. Why bother even using it? Right. So,
yeah. Well, no, I always love, like, if you had an 80% probability of success and you update it every year, right? Like, you're just narrowing in, like 80%, a 20% chance of failure one time is that's still scary to me. But if every year I'm looking at it. So yeah, I think we all I think we want so bad, like a law of gravity. We just want, like, to be able to grab onto it. And it turns out that money and markets and humans, when you mix humans and markets, you are in like the classic definition of a complex adaptive system.
Yeah.
And in complex adaptive systems, there are no rules. And the only way to navigate it is, from the literature, the only way to navigate it is solve for the next local optimum.
Yeah.
Right. The next step, and then reset and do it again and again and again.
Yeah.
So you're narrowing in that range of outcomes. You're not drawing a straight line to it.
Yeah. I had an old boss where the motto was, there are no rules here, and whatever rules there are subject to be broken at any given moment.
Yeah. No, I think that's really, really true. And it's, I used to really hammer on, like, because I went through a phase where I was like, no planning, right? Like, why even plan?
Right.
So the one-page financial plan was a negotiation on my part, right? Like, okay, fine, we'll have one page. But then I realized, like, I got that wrong. What it is it's not an or, it's an and, right? Like, we're going to build the best plan ever created, and it's going to be wrong.
You're right.
And we got to hold both those truths at the same time. So yes, I'm still a technical rock star. I'm better than anybody else. I'm the best guesser. My assumptions are better than everybody else's. I've thought about it to the nth degree, and I know they're wrong. Right. That to me is the beautiful space that we live in. And it requires being an adult to hold two competing truths at the same time.
Yeah. So I would add two ands, right? One, and it's wrong, and it's going to be monitored, and it's going to be adjusted. And
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. So the other element of financial planning is this notion of, we know where we want to go. We also have to assess where we are, right? The current reality, and taking a look at balance sheets. And I loved how you described a balance sheet as not just the numbers, but it's the patina of a story, right? There's a story behind those numbers. Talk more about that.
Yeah, I always thought that was a discovery for me, because I always thought, like, oh, it was always sort of like a sigh of relief, because like this goals stuff, and those are projections and we don't know. And I was always like, oh, good, we can get to the concrete numbers. Like, this is quantifiable, and it is, right? Like, and I always thought, like, current reality, in other words, just a balance sheet. I thought the balance sheet was going to be the easy part. And to some degree it is. I mean, very few people, it's still kind of crazy to me how few people actually know where they currently are. But even, let's pretend like the clients do. We have to remember that every line item on that balance sheet is a set of beliefs, stories, opinions. And if you're dealing with a couple, there's often conflict about the opinion on every number, like, especially if you get to debt. But even on assets that have done well, you can get one spouse that says, I knew we should have bought more of that, right? Like, why didn't we do that? And you can have the family cabin that you inherited from the grandmother. Well, like, there's all sorts of embedded stories and emotion in that. So I think it's like a nonfiction document that's just woven through with fictional stories. And that we need to be a little more just kind of like aware and human about that when we dive into it, because sometimes we can be so fact-based, like the life insurance, like somebody's going to die, and I'm just going to ask you, like, sometimes we just have to pause and realize, like, especially think about, I mean, this audience, right? Like, changes in asset allocation and the investment process. That portfolio, somebody's coming to you with a portfolio. They're coming to you for a reason. They probably want to make some change, whatever that change is. Like, the person's been terrible, the portfolio's underperformed, whatever it is. You're most likely, I only saw like one or two cases in my whole career where the money was actually invested the way I thought it should be. Mm-hmm. But most likely you're going to suggest some changes. Often those changes are dramatic. You just need to remember somebody thought those were a good idea. Right. And even if it was a third party, like, oh, the old financial person didn't know what they were doing, the people you're sitting with approved those decisions. Yeah. And I just think we need to be a little aware of what we're leading them into. That's all I mean by that. Yeah.
You also mentioned in the video this notion of no shame, no blame. And I'm sure for clients where you may have a long-term relationship, that feelings of shame and blame go away, but maybe you're dealing with a new client who is afraid that they'll be judged about their balance sheet and their net worth statement and their cash flow statement.
Yeah, Bob, I think like the easiest way to handle that is to just call it out and say, hey, look, we're going to be looking at the past now. And the past, we just have to have a rule. And someday we will, at the Society of Advice, we're going to make no shame, no blame hats, because I've always joked about them. And we get emails all the time like, when are you going to have those hats? I used to joke, I'd tell the clients, look, we're going to be looking at the past. I want you to put on a metaphorical no shame, no blame hat right now, right? Like the past will be valuable because we'll have some lessons. It leads breadcrumbs. It will help us make decisions. There are good things, there are bad things, but let's not have any shame or blame. That all started because I had somebody really close to me that they made a decision with the best of intentions that went sideways. It was a big they were real estate developers. It was a couple, a husband and wife, and they made a decision, and really the husband had driven this decision, and it went bad. And I've been around these people for almost 30 years, and still to this day, every single time money comes up, every single time something is said by one party or the other about shame or blame. Like, I can't believe we did that. That was so stupid. And if we understand Brene Brown's work around shame and blame, like, shame serves no useful purpose. And I'm not saying guilt or responsibility, that's a different discussion, but shame serves no useful purpose. Shame is, I'm so stupid, instead of like, that may have been a bad decision. And so I think if we just call it out, we're looking at the past. We're not going to feel any shame or blame about the past. We're going to use the lessons. If there's mistakes, we're going to try not to repeat them. If there's good things, we're going to try and do more of them. Like, everybody cool, put on your no shame, no blame hats. Let's go. Right? Like that kind of idea.
All right. So we've got purpose. We've covered goals. We've covered the current reality. So we know where we are. We know where we're going. Now we have to set a course. And you say there's a difference between a plan and the process of planning.
Yeah. I love this. And sometimes it sounds so obvious, but as an industry, we've often sort of gotten confused. I think it kind of developed, and you've watched this happen, right? Like, we were stockbrokers, then we became we discovered asset allocation along with risk tolerance questionnaires, and out of the bottom popped a portfolio. And so we went from stockbrokers being the product to a portfolio being the product. And now I think largely we've seen this movement to, often, unfortunately, the plan has become a product. And when we understand that the plan's totally worthless without the ongoing process, we start to realize, like, yeah, that document, we hired a new financial planner, like, I think we're going on 8 months now. And she's like a huge planner. Like, there's going to be this plan. And I realized maybe 5 months into it, we had a conversation on Friday, my wife and I, and our financial planner, her name's Christy. And we had a conversation on Friday. She was going to work over the weekend for the plan. And over the weekend, something changed. Right. And so I came to this conclusion, like, there's never going to be a big plan. Yeah. Right. Like, it's always going to be adjusting. It's always fluid. And so, yeah, there may be a baseline document, a little bit like a pilot would have a flight plan. Mm-hmm. There's a baseline document, and you're going to be the best in the world at making that document. And then you're going to realize that it was wrong. And so engaging in the process instead of being too worried about the actual plan, because clients have caught on to this. Like, I get a lot of emails from New York Times readers saying, I don't want to go see a financial planner. I'm going to end up with a 2-inch thick doorstop that nobody ever looks at again. Well, no, that's worthless.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a couple things. One is Michael Finca once said to me that, these plans are right once, the first time that they're written, and then never again. And then also I had a chance to talk to Susan Bradley and Ross Marino a little bit ago. They've written a book. Ross has had some tragedy in his financial planning practice in his personal life. And he describes it as, well, I'm not creating a plan as much as I'm trying to prepare you. Like, we don't even call it a plan anymore, where we talk about financial preparation as opposed to a plan.
I love that. Right. I love that. I just think what those stories remind me of is that this is just reality-based financial planning. Yeah. Like, what if we just come to grips with the fact that there's no way we can know? And once we come to grips with that, of course, there's a little bit of chess that we need to play in terms of how we present it, because we know the guy down the street, and it's normally a guy down the street, this is selling a bunch of certainty. And if we're being honest, and how do we deal with that? And of course, there's some we need to figure that out. But I think those examples, how do you know what the next 30 years are going to look like? And something like that, it can be worldwide plans blow up. It can be our individual lives. It can be related to the market. It could be related to our health. It could be like, there's so many variables there. But yeah, just saying, look, our goal here is to make sure you're prepared. Like, that's beautiful.
Yeah. You also talk about the need to be empathetic in this, in terms of planning process.
Yeah, I just think we're so funny. Like, and again, you've watched this happen, right? Like, as soon as we discovered behavioral finance, we got this sense of smugness. Like, we were looking down on all the humans and saying, look how silly they behave. And we were forgetting that we do it ourselves, and that it's natural, and that there's a reason Daniel Kahneman writes 300 and 400 page books, right? Like, it's a challenge. And so I think if we can just, and I can give you an example, and I love to go do this on Twitter. Whenever the market, we have a big correction, it's scary. The news is scary. I love to go watch what financial advisors are saying on Twitter. And it's almost always just spraying people with facts and figures, and almost like making people feel dumb that they're scared.
Right.
And I'm just saying, like, what if we just said, we were a little human about it? Like, hey, I get nervous when I read the news too.
Yeah.
And then I got to go back and sort of remind myself. And I always think of it like, instead of, here's one way to think about it. When somebody has a well-designed portfolio and something goes south, or a well-designed plan and something goes south, let's just use whole markets, right? The portfolio is down 30%. The market's down 30%. Of course, we all know the problem with this financial pornography circus out there, right? Of course, all the talking heads are going to be yelling about sell, 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 sell. How are you being there? And if a client calls, you've designed this beautiful portfolio with the weighty evidence of history. You knew there was going to be a time it was going to be down 30%. You knew that because it's in the data. And the client calls and they want to sell it. The portfolio is perfectly designed to help them meet their goals. They want to sell it. That is an irrational decision. We all know that. So if somebody's in the middle of making an irrational decision, the last thing that works is to reason with them. Right? Like, try this with your teenage kid next time, right? Like, try telling somebody who's currently smoking about the research on lung cancer while they're smoking, right? It doesn't work. So instead of spraying them, what they really want is a hug. What they really want is to be heard. And so I always like to think, like, yes, the facts and figures are going to be important. Yes, even the lecture might be important, but first a hug. Like, can we just, hey, I understand you're nervous. Sounds like you're nervous. I've been watching the news. I get nervous too. Would you be okay if I go grab your file, right? And I love the please hold method. Just like, give them a moment to just catch their breath. They made the hard call, even if your file's already up. Can you hold just a second? I'm going to run grab your file. Then we can take them from this fear place back to ground. Hey, remember when we first met, Bob? You told me you just didn't want to be a burden to the kids. And if there was some left over, is that still true? Yeah, that's still true. Okay, cool. Before we get to what you're worried about, I just want to check in. And what that meant is you wanted a $5,000 check in the mail. Does that still feel about right? Yeah, totally. So we've moved up from purpose to goals. And now we can say, okay, great. Remember, based on that, we built this portfolio. Let's talk about what you're worried about, right? Like, so we've regrounded them, and then we can talk about the facts and figures. So that's how I think we just need to stop being so smug about it all.
Yeah. As an aside, I just interviewed Rabbi Leader, who will be speaking at one of the Investment and Wealth Institute conferences coming up in September, and his Kol Nidre sermon will be about hugging and how we lost it during COVID and the importance of it. So
yeah, I can't imagine.
I can't wait to listen to his sermon. The last thing that you mentioned in your video is about enjoying compounding, which you didn't address a lot, but it seems like, well, that helps us get to the end game, doesn't it, in a way?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting how hard it is to let things that compound, right? Like, so hard. Like, we want to pull up the tree and check if the roots are growing all the time. And I think there's a couple of things that compound. Obviously, compound interest we're all familiar with, but this idea of a compounding relationship and compound impact and compound trust, compound influence, like that's what's so beautiful about this business, if you will, the job of being an advisor institutionally to private clients, that you get to see impact over a decade or two, or maybe even three, if you're lucky, of working with people and letting those things compound and do their job and realize that you're, returning calls promptly. Like that's a form of compound impact, right? Rapid response to a problem, being there when you feel like March of last year, you just wanted to stay in bed, but you showed up anyway, and you actually reached out and said, hey, I know there's stuff going on, let's talk, right? That's building compound relationships. So I think letting things compound is, we all know the power of that when we look at, Morgan Housel's book, that little stat he has on Buffett, fasting, right? Whatever that, I can't remember the number, like after he was eligible for Social Security or something, was like the powerful thing. We all understand that, but I think compounding influence, impact, and reach are important too.
Yeah. You mentioned behavioral finance a second ago. I would be remiss not to mention that the profession is now going full force into this area, right? The CFP board is now making it part of the curriculum. The Investments Wealth Institute has several programs around behavioral finance. How important is it that advisors become knowledgeable about DeFi?
I don't know how you, I'm speechless about that question. You know what I mean? That's my answer. You have to, right? Like because you can design, and we've all done this. I bet everybody listening to this has had this experience. You design the greatest portfolio ever created, ever.
Yeah.
One behavioral mistake a decade. You may as well have been in T-bills.
Yeah.
And so I think understanding, and particularly understanding how to kind of absorb with empathy those challenges, and then help people understand, like, look, the fact that you're feeling that way, right? If you really understand, Kahneman's book to me was slightly frustrating, because right in the very beginning, he says, look, I didn't write this book in hopes that we would solve the problem. And I think he even said something like, I just wrote this book so that next time you make a mistake, you'll know what it's called.
Right.
Right. So the idea that we understand, and whoever said, like, if you were going to design a poor investor, you would design a human, like, so I think it's not just knowing. I've done a bunch of programs with big companies around understanding the behavioral finance, like the term loss aversion or the endowment effect or the recency bias or overconfidence, all those things. That's important. Knowing how to have the conversations around it when it's showing up is, I think, where we're still need a lot of work.
Yeah. So speaking of a lot of work, each and every year, whether you're talking to Michael or Bob Veras or whomever, right, we're always at an inflection point here in this profession. What do you think needs to happen in order for it to sort of become what it could be?
Yeah, this would be, I get asked this question a lot, and my answer is almost always the same. Like, I don't really know. I'm often wrong, but never in doubt. And this would be true here, because I think the never in doubt part is, like, I think we need to be more human. I think this fear we had of being replaced by robots I think it was just actually a forcing function for us to understand what the real value is. And the real value is what uniquely humans can deliver, because real life doesn't fit in an algorithm. And so us getting better at that while maintaining our technical skills, getting better at the ability to say, oh, Bob, that's really interesting, because what you just said doesn't match what you told me 6 months ago, right? Like, one of my favorite lines on that is, hey, Bob, what I'm about to, you may fire me for what I'm about to say, but you should definitely fire me if I don't, right? 6 months ago, you told me this, and now you want to do this. And I could give you hundreds of examples, but just for the sake of time, right? Like, there's something, there's a conflict, a trade-off that you've changed your mind on. let's talk about it, right? Like you can't really do that. If I go in and change it in an algorithm, it doesn't. And so I think more and more, we're going to get better at that. And that doesn't have to look like, although I'm really excited about the kind of emerging field of financial therapy, it doesn't have to look like that. Again, at an institutional level, it can be like, well, wait. I've got the notes from the board meeting 6 months ago. And I mean, this exact example, I don't go into it, but the notes from the board meeting 6 months ago, you were all nervous about your asset allocation being too heavy equity. And now that the market's up, you want to increase it? Can we talk about that? Right? I can change that in a computer program, no problem. But a human can say, hey, I'm not saying that's the wrong decision. Let's just talk about it. So I see the industry, I hope we're moving more that direction.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground. Anything that we haven't touched upon that you would like to mention before we wrap up, or anything that you've already mentioned that you might want to just reemphasize?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the one thing I would say is like, I can't remember a time. I don't know if this is true for you. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I can't remember a time when real financial advice, not the fake stuff, but real financial advice was more valuable, right? Like, whether the world is more uncertain or not, I don't really actually care about that debate. It's clear it feels more uncertain, and that's what matters. And in moments of uncertainty like this, in my travels, I mean, I've spent 4 years living in New Zealand, and then a year in London, and traveled all over the world meeting with investors, advisors, and the public. And the word that keeps coming up about how people feel about money is anxious. And it's not going down. Like the feeling's getting stronger. And that's despite the whole sections of Barnes and Noble and all the cool kid apps and the new budgeting thing and the thing on your phone and whatever. So despite all that, the problem seems to be getting worse. And I can only think of one solution for most people. And that solution is a real advisor saying, hey, let me help you navigate all of this. Yeah. And so I would just encourage people to realize, like, your value's never been greater. Like, the work you do is never, and I'm only saying this because I think we have a professional self-esteem issue, because we get the tar beaten out of us in newspapers and in the public, and probably well-deserved from the industry. And yet there's the quiet, real financial advisor who's making a massive difference in their lives, and they wonder what their value is. And I would just beg you to believe me, like, it's never been greater.
Yeah. So my hope is, as you think about your next diagram, maybe there's one that says Carl and one that says Bob, and in the middle it says wisdom. And then hopefully that's what people will get from watching this, listening to this. That's a great idea.
That's a great idea. Yeah, super fun. Bob, I do a lot of these. And it's super apparent when somebody's done the work to make them amazing. So thanks for the work that you're doing for the industry. And it was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Appreciate it.
Yep, cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsandwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.